Happiness, Part 9, tidbits. Uh, if you've actually watched the first 8 parts, let me tell you, I love you because I really appreciate that. That I don't know whether they're inherently interesting or whether they're only interesting to me. But anyway, thank you if you have. And I hope this number 9 is rewarding. Okay. Let me give some examples of therapeutic experiences. I made disparaging remarks about some therapeutic styles earlier, and the dependence on therapy. This is an American thing. The British are kind of contemptuous in that they assume that children have to be enrolled in therapy in order to get in line to get a good therapist when they're old enough, because Americans are so oriented toward this. Therapy, if it works right, is a form of education. Most education in America doesn't work. Psychotherapy is an example of one that's designed typically to suit the therapist. However, let me give you a couple of examples. In 1961, I was in psychotherapy. I was probably maybe 1960, so I was 22, something like that. And I was in psychotherapy. My father called the therapist. My father was paying for it. The therapist would not accept money from a third party. And boy, has that changed. Would not accept money from the third party. It had to be from the client. The client had to be giving up something. So my father gave me the money. He was happy to take it. So I was only in therapy for a couple of months then. And when my father called him, my father thought he was an important My father thought my father was an important person. And if he called a doctor, the doctor would be happy to tell how it was coming. And the guy said, 1, it's none of your business, and 2, even if I tried to explain it, how would you understand it? You don't have any intellectual basis for understanding this. Now, my parents were supporting me then. My father was supporting me. He was supporting my mother also. They were married, but my mother never really worked. And so the therapist put him down, essentially. And being present, the therapist wouldn't talk to him on the telephone unless I was present. And then he put him down, and not really, he wasn't quite as rude as I'm describing it, but that's essentially what he said. And that was a therapeutic experience. That altered the degree to which I cared at all about what either of my parents had thought. But there was no psychological relationship where I was concerned about that. Still concerned about getting the money, but not about, there was no other control. A couple of years later, I was about 23, I was in group therapy. And I was enrolled in school, I think, but I wouldn't do any work. So my parents assumed that, therapy is what you're supposed to have. So I was in a therapy group for a couple of months. It was a professor who was a very successful therapist and a very well-known professor of psychology. Someone, they got a lot of media attention and generally was highly regarded. After a couple of months, I was out of money. So I told him, yeah, I'm out of money. He said, just, keep coming, and, I'll put it on your bill, and then, if you ever get the money, you can pay me. Well, that's somewhat unusual among psychotherapists, is now and was then. And he wasn't a very good therapist, despite the fact that he was pretty famous. But the fact that this guy believed in me enough to essentially say, if you ever get it, pay me. In the meantime, he wanted me in therapy. He wanted, it was something, I was somebody I wanted to work with. The fact that he believed in me had strong therapeutic results. His notions of human behavior were really not very good. I ended up a far better therapist than he ever was when I became one. I was taking a course in 1963 in tests and measurements, psychology. I was I think a grad student by then, and I didn't come to class for 6 weeks, 40% of the semester. I just didn't go to class. And I had made, it turns out, I had made the highest grade on the midterm exam, and then didn't show up again. And so the professor, was kind of curious about that. And when I went back and said, look, can I get back into the class? I know it's late. He said, well, yeah, I think I can give you a final. You missed a couple of tests, but I can give you a final that's comprehensive. So he let me come back in. Some guy I knew in the class said, where have you been? Well, I was in my apartment doing drugs of some type and betting on football, and didn't come out. I mean, hardly came out of my apartment for 6 weeks. And I was reading newspapers to dope out football games and then putting money in with the bookmaker. But basically, in another world, because I was drug affected. And when I went back to the class, the guy said, so what have you been doing? I said, well, I've been busy, I said, being the phony that I was. And he said, I bet you haven't done a goddamn thing. And I said, you're right, I haven't done a goddamn thing. And that was so liberating. I mean, it was so liberating just to say the truth. And so my interaction with this guy, that was therapeutic. And since then, it's been very easy to say whatever is true, because who am I going to fool? But the idea is I was liberated psychologically to do that. When I was a teaching fellow in economics, and I was about 30 years old then, and we used to, the grad students in economics used to get into political arguments, and I would get very heated in the arguments. Sometimes yell, not yell, but talk very, very loud and aggressively about a political issue. And then I was sitting there, and there was a disagreement with one guy, and someone stated a position, and I was thinking, no, you stupid bastard, that's wrong. What's the time?
9:45.
Okay, I have to finish this. What tape is this?